In the year 1799, Mexico City stood as one of the largest and most complex cities in the Americas. It was a place of contradictions. Wide cobblestone streets led to ornate colonial mansions with balconies draped in silk, where the wealthy sipped imported chocolate and discussed the latest political rumors from Spain. At the same time, only a few blocks away, crumbling adobe homes leaned against each other for support, their dirt floors swept daily by mothers who had little more than beans and tortilla as to feed their children. The air itself carried two very different scents, fresh bread and spices drifting from bakeries in the Plaza Mayor, and the pungent odor of refuse from alleys where the poor lived elbow to elbow. Horse-drawn carriages rolled past barefoot children, and street vendors called out their wares while beggars sat silently at church doors, hoping for a coin or a scrap of bread. The city was alive, vibrant, but it was also deeply divided. In the heart of this bustling capital stood a structure that both belonged to the city and in a strange way was separate from it, the San Hipólito Hospital. Its weathered stone walls bore the marks of centuries. Founded in the 16th century, it had the distinction and the burden of being the first hospital in the Americas created to care for people who were mentally ill. In a time when mental illness was poorly understood and often feared, San Hipólito became a place of confinement for those society considered different. Some patients truly suffered from conditions beyond the medical knowledge of the time. Others had simply been abandoned by their families for being inconvenient, an elderly father who wandered at night, a young woman who refused to marry the man her parents had chosen, a merchant who talked to himself in the market. From the outside, the hospital's facade gave no hint of what lay within. A massive wooden door, iron-studded and heavy, guarded the entrance. Above it, a carved stone cross served as a reminder of its religious origins. Inside, the air was cool and dim, the thick walls muffling the noise of the city beyond. The hospital was run by a combination of clergy and lay workers. Priests administered the sacraments, prayed over the sick, and offered confessions to those lucid enough to speak. Nurses, most of them women from humble backgrounds, cleaned wounds, bathed patients, and prepared simple meals. Orderlies kept the wards in order, restraining those who became violent and escorting visitors through the labyrinth of corridors. Life inside San Hipólito was harsh, but it was not without compassion. There were staff members who genuinely cared, who saw the humanity in their patients even when others saw only madness. They listened to the stories that spilled out during moments of clarity, and they offered kindness in a place where kindness was often scarce. Yet the hospital also carried the weight of its time. Treatments were crude and sometimes cruel by modern standards. Patients might be subjected to cold baths to shock them into calmness or kept in isolation for days. The hospital lacked the resources to care for everyone properly, and overcrowding was constant. The well in the central courtyard, once the pride of the hospital for its pure water, was now a quiet witness to decades of whispered prayers, muffled cries, and the heavy silence of resignation. The city around the hospital barely noticed it. For the wealthy, San Hipólito was simply a distant place where troublesome relatives could be sent away and forgotten. For the poor, it was a mysterious building whose gates they passed quickly, whispering prayers under their breath. The patients themselves existed in a strange in-between world, part of the city, yet invisible to it. But San Hipólito was more than a prison for the unwanted. It was, in its own way, a mirror of Mexico City itself, a place of resilience and survival, where those with the least found ways to endure. Within its walls, moments of grace occurred daily, a nurse slipping an extra piece of bread to a hungry patient, two strangers holding hands in silent comfort, a priest kneeling beside a bed to pray for someone who had long given up on prayer. In 1799, the hospital stood on the edge of change. The city was growing, political unrest was brewing in the colonies, and new ideas about medicine and humanity were beginning to filter in from Europe. But for the people inside San Hipólito, life went on as it always had, measured not in revolutions or reforms, but in the slow passing of days, marked by the morning bell for prayer, the ladle of soup at midday, and the cool, still air of the courtyard at night. It was in this courtyard, beside the old stone well, that the story truly began. That well, so ordinary to the eye, held a secret that had been gathering for years, a secret that would soon come to light, changing not just the hospital, but the hearts of those who worked within its walls. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper that no one is quite sure they heard. In the early months of 1799, some of the nurses at San Hipólito Hospital began murmuring about strange occurrences near the courtyard's well. At first, it was nothing more than the sort of gossip that floated between the laundry and the kitchen, odd sounds at night, a sense of being watched when drawing water in the early dawn. One young nurse named Isabel claimed that as she leaned over to lower the bucket, she heard what she swore was a man's voice, faint and muffled, as though it rose from somewhere deep below. It was not an echo, she insisted to her companions, her eyes wide. It said something I could not understand, but it was speaking to me. Others laughed it off. The hospital was full of strange noises, the creak of old wood, the rustle of rats in the storerooms, the sigh of wind slipping through cracked windows. But Isabel's account planted a seed, and soon other stories began to emerge. A kitchen helper reported that the water she drew from the well had a peculiar smell, metallic, almost like rust, though the bucket was clean. An orderly swore he saw ripples in the water when there was no wind and no movement, as if something just beneath the surface had disturbed it. And then there were the dreams. Several patients began to describe, without prompting, similar visions during the night. A pair of pale hands reaching out of darkness, offering something unseen. One older patient, who had been in the hospital for decades, said the hands belonged to the keeper of secrets, a figure he claimed had been watching over the well since long before the hospital was built. To him, the dreams were a sign, not of danger, but of a message waiting to be heard. To the nurses and orderlies, however, these coincidences began to feel less like imagination and more like a shadow creeping into their daily lives. They started drawing water in pairs, avoiding the well after sunset. Meals prepared with its water seemed to carry an unshakable aftertaste, and the laundry women complained that linens washed in it no longer smelled clean, even after hours of boiling. Whispers reached the ears of Father Antonio, the hospital chaplain. A serious man with gentle eyes, he had served at San Hipólito for years and had seen how fear could spread like a fever in a place where hope was already fragile. At first, he suspected these rumors were born of fatigue. The staff worked long, grueling hours, the patients were restless, and the looming summer heat made tempers short. But when he began hearing similar accounts from different wards, spoken by people who had no contact with one another, he felt an unease settle in his chest. The governor of the hospital, Don Hernan de Velasco, was not so easily swayed. A practical man, he dismissed the stories as foolishness. A well is a well, he told Father Antonio. It provides water, not voices, and as for the smell, water changes with the seasons. The city's aqueducts are not immune to it. But reality began to challenge his certainty. The patient's health took a turn. Cases of stomach illness rose. Skin rashes appeared among those who drank most frequently from the well. The doctors blamed poor hygiene, but the timing was suspicious. The well, once the heart of the courtyard's life, was becoming something people avoided if they could. The turning point came one humid evening in June. Isabel, the nurse who had first reported the voice, came running into the ward pale as linen. She had gone to draw water for the night's soup, and as she peered into the well, she claimed she saw not her reflection, but the reflection of a man's face, a face she did not recognize, staring back at her from below. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the dark water, but she was certain she had seen it. That same night, a patient in the men's ward began shouting in his sleep, crying out that the letters are drowning. No one understood what he meant, but the words stuck with Father Antonio. By morning, the chaplain had made up his mind. He would push for an examination of the well, no matter how reluctant the governor might be. Fear was one thing, but fear tied to illness and to signs too strange to ignore was another. He knew the hospital had always been a place of suffering, but it was also a place where healing, however imperfect, was meant to happen. If the very water they drank and washed in had been tainted, whether by natural decay or by something far darker, then they owed it to every soul inside those walls to uncover the truth. The complaints had begun as whispers, but now they demanded action. And in the quiet heart of the hospital, the well seemed to wait, holding its secret just beyond reach, as if daring them to look inside. By the end of June 1799, the unease at San Hipólito Hospital had become impossible to ignore. The strange sounds, the foul smell of the water, the patients' shared dreams, these might have been dismissed in another time as superstition, but now there was something more tangible: illness. Cases of fever and stomach sickness were increasing, and the well stood at the center of every whispered theory. Father Antonio, who had long served as the hospital's chaplain, felt a growing conviction that something in the well was at the root of it all. He had prayed for clarity, but what he received instead was a deep sense of urgency. The staff, already burdened with caring for the city's most vulnerable, were now quietly avoiding the water altogether, fetching it from outside whenever possible. That alone was enough to raise alarm if the well could not be trusted. The heart of the hospital's daily operations was compromised. The obstacle was Don Hernan de Velasco, the hospital's governor. A man of rigid pride, he hated to admit when he was wrong. To acknowledge that the well might be contaminated would not only bring shame to the hospital, but could draw unwanted attention from the colonial authorities. In his mind, that risk outweighed any phantom illnesses or superstitions. But Father Antonio was not a man to be easily swayed when the welfare of souls was at stake. Over the course of a week, he began quietly gathering testimony. He spoke to Isabel, the nurse who had first heard the voice. He listened to the kitchen staff describe the taste of the water. He recorded the dates of the patients' illnesses and compared them to the days they drank from the well. The pattern was clear. Every new case could be traced back to it. When he finally confronted Don Hernan, he brought not just fear, but evidence. "If the water is pure, we will find no harm," Father Antonio said, his tone calm but firm, "and if it is not, we may save lives by acting now." The governor resisted, but the illness in the wards was reaching a point where he could no longer ignore it without risking his position. Reluctantly, he gave his approval. A team of workers was assembled, men accustomed to hard labor, used to hauling heavy stones and cleaning the deep cisterns that supplied parts of the city. They arrived at dawn with thick ropes, buckets, and lanterns. The courtyard was eerily quiet that morning. Patients watched from windows, whispering to each other. Some crossed themselves as the workers approached the well. Isabel stood near the chaplain, her hands clenched in her apron, her eyes fixed on the dark circle of water. The first step was to test the depth. A long rope was lowered with a weight tied to its end. The workers measured the distance, calling out the numbers as the rope sank deeper than expected, deeper than anyone remembered. The well was old, and like much in the hospital, its history was imperfectly recorded. No one knew exactly how long it had gone without being fully drained. Next came the slow process of emptying it. Bucket by bucket, the water was hauled up and poured into barrels to be examined later. At first, the water was only murky, with bits of dirt and plant matter swirling in the light. But as the level sank lower, the smell intensified, a pungent mix of rot and something metallic, like old blood. One of the workers muttered a prayer under his breath. Another asked for a lantern to be lowered so they could see what lay at the bottom. The flickering light revealed more than just mud. There were shapes, small, angular objects wedged between stones and silt, too regular to be natural debris. "Could be crates," one man suggested, though his voice carried doubt. Crates were not usually found in wells. The idea that they might have been thrown in intentionally unsettled everyone. Father Antonio felt his pulse quicken. Whatever lay down there had been hidden for a reason. He ordered the workers to be careful, to lift everything intact if possible. The governor, standing nearby, said nothing now. His earlier confidence had drained away with the water. As the afternoon sun moved across the courtyard, the barrels of stagnant water stood in a line, and the well's bottom came slowly into view. The objects were indeed small boxes, wooden, sealed with pitch. The workers lifted the first one out, its surface slick and blackened by years in the water. It was heavier than expected, and when placed on the stone edge of the well, it gave off a faint but unmistakable scent of aged paper. By then, even the most skeptical among them knew they were not just cleaning a water source. They were unearthing something hidden, something meant to stay unseen. The courtyard felt charged with anticipation, as if the very air was waiting for the first box to be opened. Father Antonio glanced at Isabel, who stood frozen, eyes fixed on the dripping wood. "We will know soon enough," he told her quietly, but deep down he wondered whether the truth would bring comfort or only more questions. The courtyard of San Hipólito was silent except for the echo of dripping water and the creak of the rope as it strained under the weight of the final load. The workers had been at it since morning, and now the well was nearly empty. The last of the water clung to the stones in dark streaks, and at the very bottom, the shapes they had glimpsed earlier sat exposed under the dim light of a lantern. The wooden boxes, half buried in silt, looked old, their edges softened by time, but they were intact. The pitch sealing them was cracked in places but still visible, glistening under the moisture. They were small enough to be carried by one person, but far too deliberately placed to be debris. The first box was pulled up slowly, hand over hand, the rope slick with water. It made a heavy thud as it landed on the courtyard stones. The sound was strange, solid, not hollow, as though whatever was inside had been tightly packed. "Open it," the governor ordered, but Father Antonio stepped forward, holding up his hand. "Not here, not like this," he said. "If these have been sealed and hidden for so long, they may be fragile. We must be careful." The workers exchanged glances, but obeyed. They brought the box to a nearby table, one that the nurses quickly cleared of its usual medical instruments. A small crowd had gathered. Nurses, orderlies, even some of the calmer patients who had crept close enough to watch. Everyone seemed to sense that this was more than just the cleaning of a well. With a small hammer, one of the workers tapped gently at the edge of the lid. The nails gave way with a faint groan, and the pitch cracked in flakes, releasing a smell that was neither entirely foul nor pleasant, more like the scent of something long kept in darkness. Inside was a layer of oilcloth, thick and waxy to the touch. When it was peeled back, the contents revealed themselves, folded papers, dozens of them, bound together with faded twine. The ink was faint in places, but still visible. Words written in an array of different hands, some shaky and uneven, others bold and careful. At first no one spoke, then Isabel stepped closer, peering down at the bundle. "Letters," she whispered, "their letters." The chaplain carefully lifted the top sheet. It was dated October 1721, nearly 80 years earlier. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, the kind of scrawl made by someone unused to holding a pen. He began to read aloud, "To my daughter, whom I will never see again. I was brought here not for madness, but for refusing a marriage I could not bear. I pray you live free. If you ever wonder if I loved you, know that I have thought of you every day." The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. One by one, more boxes were retrieved from the well. Each contained similar bundles, letters written by different hands in different years, each telling its own story. Some were pleas for forgiveness, others were confessions of crimes, some real and some imagined. Many were simple messages of love, to mothers, to children, to friends lost to time. As the chaplain read, a picture began to form. These were not the official records of the hospital. They were personal, intimate, and, most striking of all, they were clearly never sent. Whoever had collected them had gone to great effort to keep them safe, wrapping them in oilcloth and sealing them in boxes. One of the older nurses, Dona Marta, recalled a story passed down from her predecessor about a compassionate caretaker, a woman named Sister Clara, who had worked at the hospital decades earlier. Clara was said to have a habit of sitting with patients in the evenings, encouraging them to write down whatever was on their hearts. Many of the patients, abandoned by their families, had no one to send their words to. The story went that Clara told them she would make sure their messages reached someone who would listen. Perhaps she meant God, perhaps she meant the future. Either way, she had kept her promise, lowering the boxes into the well. a place she knew was both central and protected, believing that someday, somehow, the words would be found. By the time the last box was opened, the sun had begun to sink behind the hospital walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The well stood empty, its stones dark and slick, no longer just a source of water, but now a silent vault of memory. For the staff and patients of San Hipólito, the discovery was more than historical curiosity. It was a reminder that every person who had passed through the hospital had been more than their illness or their misfortune. They had been human, with hopes, regrets, and love worth remembering. Father Antonio looked at the small mountain of letters on the table. "These voices have been silent for too long," he said quietly. "Now they will be heard." And in that moment the well was no longer a place of fear. It had become a monument to those forgotten lives, a testament that even when the world turns away, the human spirit finds a way to speak. The courtyard of San Hipólito had seen many things in its long history, moments of healing, moments of suffering, and moments so ordinary they vanished into memory, but never had it witnessed something like this. The letters, now carefully laid out on tables covered in clean linen, drew everyone like a magnet. Staff members who had been working in separate wards came to read them in hushed tones. Even patients who rarely left their beds found the strength to sit and listen as Father Antonio or one of the nurses read aloud. The stories inside those pages were varied, but they shared a common heartbeat, the need to be heard. Some of the letters were heartbreaking confessions, others were simple expressions of longing. Many carried a tone of gratitude, thanking an unnamed doctor, nurse, or fellow patient for a moment of kindness in an otherwise difficult life. One letter, written in an unsteady hand, said, "To the man who sat with me when I could not sleep, your silence was more comfort than 100 prayers. I will never know your name, but I pray for you each night." Another, written in perfect script, spoke of injustice. "I was not mad when I arrived, but now I fear I might be. Loneliness is a sickness no doctor can cure. Still, I forgive those who sent me here. They feared what they did not understand." And then there were the love letters, dozens of them. Words from husbands to wives they would never see again, from mothers to children taken away, from friends separated by illness or the cruel judgment of the times. In these lines, the walls of San Hipólito dissolved, and you could almost see the person as they were before life placed them here. Someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's beloved. As the nurses read through them, a truth began to settle in. These letters were not simply artifacts of the past. They were mirrors. They reflected the same needs that every person, rich or poor, sick or well, still carries. The need for love, the need for forgiveness, the need for dignity. Isabel, who had been the first to hear the strange voice from the well, found herself lingering over one particular letter. It was unsigned and undated, but the words pierced her heart. "If these words reach anyone, know this. My name is not important. What matters is that I lived and I loved, even in this place, and that is enough." That single sentence reshaped how she saw her work. The patients were not just names in a ledger or conditions to be managed. They were people in the middle of stories that deserved respect, stories still unfolding, even if the world outside chose not to see them. Father Antonio felt the same shift. He realized that the hospital, for all its limitations and imperfections, had been entrusted with more than the care of bodies. It was a keeper of souls. And while medicine might one day advance to heal the mind, compassion was a cure available immediately, requiring no more than the willingness to listen. The identity of the person who had hidden the letters became less important than the act itself. Whoever it was, Sister Clara, as some believed, or perhaps more than one compassionate soul, they had chosen to preserve the voices of the forgotten. They could have burned the letters, destroyed them, or let them rot. Instead, they sealed them against time, as if whispering to the future, "Remember us, we mattered." It struck Father Antonio that the well had been more than a hiding place. In many cultures, wells were symbols of life, of connection to something deep and unseen. Here, it had become a kind of altar, a place where the most intimate truths could be placed in trust, not to be judged, but to be kept safe until the day they could be revealed. The letters began to change the daily rhythm of the hospital. Staff members who had grown hardened by years of difficult work softened in their interactions. A nurse might pause longer at a bedside, listening without rushing. An orderly might share a kind word instead of a command. Patients, seeing their own humanity reflected in the words of those who had come before, began to open up in ways they never had. And outside the hospital, news of the discovery began to spread. Scholars came to examine the letters, but more importantly, ordinary citizens came to hear them read. They realized that mental illness, poverty, and isolation were not conditions that stripped away one's worth. They were circumstances, often cruel ones, but they did not define the entirety of a life. The meaning behind the letters was simple, yet profound. Every voice matters, and every life leaves a mark. The people who wrote them might have been forgotten by history, but their words had endured. They had survived water, darkness, and the weight of years, emerging intact to speak to a generation that might finally listen. In the end, San Hipólito's well became more than just an empty shaft of stone. It became a symbol of hope, the kind that lies quietly in the dark, waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface. And for those who read the letters, there was no escaping the truth they carried. No matter how small you think your voice is, no matter how forgotten you feel, your story matters. One act of kindness, one word of encouragement, one honest expression of love can outlast centuries. Years passed after the events of 1799, but the story of the San Hipólito well never truly faded from the streets of Mexico City. It became a whispered cautionary tale told in marketplaces, in the quiet corners of churches, and around the small fires of working-class homes. Those who had lived through the strange days when the hospital staff found the letters and the bodies remembered the tension, the fear, but also the hope that bloomed from the tragedy. The authorities had closed the case with an official explanation, but people knew the truth ran deeper. The bones retrieved from the depths of the well were buried in a simple mass grave, unmarked except for a wooden cross with no names. Yet for many, they were more than remains. They were a reminder of what happens when society turns its face away from the suffering of its most vulnerable. Dr. Esquivel, the man who had led the search, continued his work at the hospital, but his approach to medicine had changed forever. He no longer saw his patients as just cases or as minds lost to madness. He saw them as stories, each one filled with pain, joy, loss, and unspoken words. The letters recovered from the well, those heartbreaking scraps of handwriting, had shown him that even the most forgotten people still longed to be heard. From that day forward, the hospital began keeping careful records of every patient who came through its gates. Names, histories, families, no one was to vanish into the world without a trace. Some staff resisted this change, thinking it was unnecessary work, but Dr. Esquivel insisted. A name, he told them, is the first step toward dignity, and dignity is the first step toward healing. In the city itself, the story took on a strange kind of moral power. Parents told their children, never throw your words into a well, they might be your last. Priests used it in sermons to remind their congregations that God sees even those the world tries to hide. And among the poor and desperate, it became a rallying cry. We will not be forgotten. But perhaps the deepest lesson came in how the people began to treat one another. For a time, neighbors paid more attention to those who seemed alone or abandoned. Vendors left extra bread at the hospital gates. A few wealthy citizens quietly funded repairs to the wards, ensuring patients had clean blankets and better food. It was not a revolution, nor did it erase the hardships of life in the sprawling, chaotic city, but it was a shift, a seed planted in the collective conscience. Decades later, when the San Hipólito Hospital itself was rebuilt and modernized, the old well was filled in, sealed beneath stone and mortar. Most who walked over that patch of earth had no idea of the history beneath their feet. But among the hospital's staff, the legend was preserved. Each new doctor and nurse heard it during their first days on the job, not as superstition, but as a reminder of the mission they carried. Some said the well had been cursed, that it had drawn in the sorrow of the forgotten until it could hold no more. Others said it had been a vessel of truth, hiding what was unbearable until the time came for it to be revealed. But for those who had looked into its dark mouth in 1799 and pulled up the letters, the truth was simple. The well had been a mirror, showing the city exactly who it was. By the turn of the 19th century, the memory of the event had faded from public conversation, replaced by new scandals, new politics, and new tragedies. Yet, for the families of the lost, the well remained a wound and a lesson. Some of them passed the story down as a warning to never let silence bury injustice. Others shared it as a message of hope, proof that even in the darkest places, someone might one day listen. In the end, the real treasure hidden in the well was not the letters, nor the grim remains, but the shift they caused in the hearts of those who learned their story. San Hipólito's well became an unseen monument not to horror but to remembrance. And though the years would bury it deeper under layers of time and stone, the lesson endured. Every soul matters. Every story deserves to be told. And when the world turns its face away, it is our duty to look closer, listen harder, and remember,